So last night I was recording a game on the Fabius Maximus beta that's currently available for Humankind, and for the first time ever, I just stopped playing the game midway through my recording. I had taken the Zhou in the Ancient Era because I had a great location for them with a ton of mountains. Then I decided I wanted to focus on some merchant gameplay to see how buyouts feel with the buyout formula being fixed, and I wound up taking the Axumites and eventually the Byzantines to really get my gold generation up. What I noticed for the beta was that this was entirely unsustainable. Just having the core districts I need and, building some of the emblematic quarters after that as I went through the eras, I would wind up spending pretty much an entire era building nothing but emblematic districts because my industry costs were so high due to the new scaling. It took forever to get my hippodromes out, and it's pretty much all I had time to build in my cities. By continuing to build these gold-generating districts, I was really just digging myself into a deeper hole because each subsequent district became more and more expensive. And I can only imagine how painful it would have been if I hadn't managed to get the pyramids at the start of the game. The change to the cost-scaling formula is really a step in the wrong direction, in my opinion. Instead of bringing builder cultures down to earth, it actually makes them even more vital than they were before, because it becomes almost impossible to develop any of your cities without a large industry base. It is hard to know how Amplitude ultimately envisions their game feeling and playing because they haven't communicated that information to us. Maybe they have some grand vision that this scaling helps achieve, but as players we can really only judge based on what we already know about the game and what already exists. I could talk a lot about all this, but I really want to come back to industry, or production as it may be called in various 4X games. Humankind has an industry problem. And really 4X games in general have a problem with industry, but it is particularly potent in Humankind. For those that have played a lot of 4X, everyone knows that industry is the backbone of whatever culture, civilization, alien hive mind, or whatever it is that you're playing. You use industry to build buildings, units, upgrades, infrastructure, so on. And the capacity of your empire to do anything comes back to industry and how quickly you can produce things. Industry is king because it can be converted into any other output that you need. If you need science, high industry is better at building research quarters. If you need money, high industry is better at building market quarters. And most importantly, if you need more industry, high industry is better at getting even more industry. In other games, this problem is disguised much better because of limitations placed on your ability to get industry. If you look at Civilization, particularly Civilization 6 is what I have in mind, there are some ways to get more industry through just building things like the industrial zone, but a lot of your industry, particularly early on, is largely constrained by your population, which forces you to invest in food if you want to continue to grow your industry. There are also some amazing civics that can dramatically improve the effectiveness of your culture or civilization in a multitude of different areas, including your production output, but you are constrained and have to make a real choice between investing in cultural output and investing in something else, like getting more industry. And importantly, in Civilization 6 in particular, the other things you need are all worth investing in. You need markets to support your armies and get trade routes. You need theater squares to get great person points and advance down the culture tree for important civics. You need aqueducts to support population. And all of these things take time to invest in, forcing you to balance your various needs really quite precisely if you want to win the game. Now, your ability to do all these things ultimately comes back to industry, and that's why I say the problem with industry is really just concealed in a game like Civilization rather than solved. But in Humankind, the industry problem isn't even concealed. It's pretty much out in the open, and the reason it is so obvious, or the reasons, are multifaceted. And first, and I think most importantly, is simply the lack of constraint on industry. Most of your industry simply comes from having districts exploiting tiles and having makers' quarters that are adjacent to each other. But you don't actually need population for this. It's just like a nice supplement. The worker slots aren't nearly as important as just having another maker's quarter. So what happens is you just invest continually in industry to infinity, because it's the most important output by enabling you to get all the other outputs that you might need, And what should be a limitation, population, doesn't actually matter. The other supposed limitation, stability, is just too easily solved. And part of that is the game balance through things like technologies and legacy traits, emblematic quarters, manufactories, all that kind of stuff. But really the main problem is that the best way to solve stability issues is simply by having high production. If you have high production, you're more capable of solving what should be a limitation than the others who have not invested in production, because you can build more infrastructure, you can build more garrisons, and you can build more commons quarters. If the solution to a limitation on a playstyle is just by investing even more in that playstyle, it's not really a limitation at all. Imagine what the game would look like if instead of just giving adjacency from building the district, there actually had to be population filling the job slot, or if specialists were more important than the district. You'd still be constrained on specialists by the number of districts that you have, so you still need production to build the districts, but you also have to invest in food in order to get the outputs. Or imagine something else entirely, like things that provide stability being tied to your influence output. What if you couldn't simply build your way out of stability issues and instead had to purchase commons quarters with influence or fill job slots on garrisons to provide stability? The game would be entirely different, and it would take power away from industry that currently does everything. And this brings me to my second point, which is that industry is such a problem right now because the other outputs aren't important enough or they're not unique enough to be worth investing in. Why invest in food for population when just building a maker's quarter or a science quarter nets you more of their respective outputs? Why pick an aesthete for influence generation when influence barely does anything after the classical era? Why build market quarters for gold when industry is just so much more effective? Yes, you do want to get those era stars, but industry provides you everything you need to get those stars by simply building the districts that generate those outputs, or producing military more effectively for expansionist military stars. By picking other cultures and investing into other things, you're actually punishing yourself with the new cost scaling because it becomes unaffordable to do anything at all. While those that did focus on industry will simply continue to construct more districts and be more effective in both the short and long term. Food and money, really, are almost entirely replaceable by simply having industry. And influence really isn't important enough. And kind of as a side note, I really think late game civics need to be game changing. Most of them kind of suck, and a lot of the unlock requirements kind of come back to your ability to produce things. So I'd love a major civics overhaul for the late game. Now, one output that isn't fully replaceable is research. Though someone with high industry can get more research quarters more quickly, but research and industry are really the two outputs that are both irreplaceable and highly important. And that's also what contributes so massively to Landraiser and Collective Minds being completely broken and utterly ridiculous. A major component of balancing a game with multiple outputs is that those outputs need to have unique purposes, so that you have incentive to invest in all of them rather than just one or two. But through Collective Minds specifically, it means a player can do nothing but build industry and still win the game pretty easily. The ability to convert the two most important outputs back and forth destroys the lanes that those two outputs exist in, and that's why Collective Minds and Landraiser will always be unbalanced so long as they remain in the game as they currently exist. So there is a problem with industry that there is nothing you can't do with it, and that negates the need for the other outputs. Influence isn't fully replaceable in the Ancients, but it really kind of falls off a cliff after that. If Amplitude wants to at least disguise the industry problem, there needs to be much better incentive to invest in other things, and reasonable limitations on your ability to accumulate industry. There was an attempt at this through changes to district cost scaling, but because this affects everyone who's trying to build anything without actually addressing the underlying value and independence of industry, it's made industry even more important than it was before the change. But all these are really just concealing the industry problem, and this is really common in all 4X games. I think philosophically, this kind of comes back to an oversimplification of what industry actually is. And this is more of a philosophical discussion. I don't think any kind of these changes are going to be implemented in Humankind, but I think it's worth talking about. When you sit down and play a 4X, you have a number that represents your industry or your production, and it's your city's capacity to build things. It doesn't matter what those things are. Your empire can turn all its industry with 100% efficiency to building whatever item is next in your building queue. The reality of industry is way more complicated than this. It takes different people and skills and materials to build new housing compared to a boat, compared to spears to outfit an army or armor or other kinds of weapons. Industry also provides consumer goods that people use in their lives. Even going back to the earliest industry, people needed pots or jugs to store things, clothes to wear, and tools to go about their jobs and their lives. And as human civilization ages, those goods got more complicated. Furniture, electronics, and so on. And to some extent, some of these industries can be retooled to different purposes. A shoemaker can provide shoes for an army if need be, just as well as they can for consumers. But does a shoemaker contribute to making a boat? Some things are less obvious, particularly after industrialization. The countries involved in, say, world wars were able to retool their economies to provide for weapons of war from civilian industry. But this required time and money and manpower in order to convert that industry into something that was usable for the war effort. And even after converting, there was still plenty of industry that was providing consumer goods, putting up skyscrapers, building roads, constructing homes, all those kind of things that you need industry for in everyday life and development of civilization. The reality of industry is that multiple things are really happening in unison, and in my opinion, the concept of industry has been overly distilled and represents the core of the industry problem in 4X games. The single number of industry represents your capacity to build anything and everything. Whether it's menial labor of dragging the next stone to the top of the pyramid, or producing highly complicated arms and materials for a contemporary military, it's all the same number. Everything is just industry. And particularly in a game like Humankind, where an overly distilled concept of industry is unbound from people actually producing things, the problem is really obvious. Factories don't become functional just from building them in real life. You need people to operate and maintain them. New housing blocks don't just fill up the moment they're built. You need the people to move into them. Just ask China about their ghost cities and massive empty highways. You don't get people producing things when they're unhappy. Look at labor strikes throughout human history. They've gone on strike for many different reasons and causes, from working conditions to general dissatisfaction with the economy. There have been revolts against rulers that have stopped industry in its tracks, so on and so forth. Now, do I think Humankind is going to solve the industry problem in 4X? No. And I do have some similar feelings about how science is portrayed as well that I'll save for another video. But I do think that Humankind can at least bandage the industry problem and make it less obvious and more balanced. But right now, I think the beta is making the problem worse rather than better, and I really hope Amplitude re-examines their approach. So thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one.